the scripture from the book of Matthew today on Epiphany Sunday. Yesterday was the festival of Epiphany, that is in the Western Church. In the Eastern Church, which follows the Julian calendar and not the Gregorian calendar as most of the world does, in the Julian calendar, Epiphany will be within 13 days. And most Orthodox churches, the Eastern churches, they will celebrate Epiphany then. Epiphany, a festival that I didn't know until I arrived in the U.S. In my tradition, there was no Epiphany celebrated. We just went from Christmas, and the next big thing was Easter. Nothing in between. So I had to really read up on this Epiphany thing in my first congregation, because I arrived in Florida in the beginning of December, so it was Advent and then Christmas and then Epiphany was, I saw this on the calendar and, didn't have a clue what I should make this about. So it's an interesting festival for me. And I've already indicated that there is a difference in the Eastern and the Western Church in the calendars and the day on which they celebrate it. But there is also a difference in the specific meaning and the main theme of the day that the two traditions assign to it. The Eastern Church, with its main language as Greek and with its headquarters or its capital based in Constantinople, in the old ancient Roman Empire, the eastern part of it, versus the western part of the church and the ancient Roman Empire, which had its headquarters in Rome, and with its main language also in worship and all other material as Latin, which was the language of the Roman, Western Roman Empire. In the Western tradition, headquarters in Rome with Latin as its language, the emphasis is on the three magi, or the wise men, or the philosophers, or the astrologers, depending on which material you read about it. These men that appeared, according to the Gospel of Matthew, around the birth of Jesus and went looking for him, following a star that stood still in that vicinity of where Jesus was born, and they consulted with King Herod, which was not a choir boy. In any terms, he would make some of the dictators that we know today look like, like choir boys. He killed his own family, all his sons and everybody associated with him, because he was afraid that they would supplant him as king, King Herod. So he was a bit of a rough diamond, more rough than diamond. So they went to consult with him, and he was frightened. Yeah, who's this king that they're talking about? And these men appeared, and they went and paid the homage, and then they went back to where they came from. Depending again on which tradition you follow and which material you read, you will find that some people say they came from Mesopotamia, from that region. Some say from Persia. Others say one guy was from Africa. And if you look at most of the artwork around this, you will see there is a guy that has a more pigmented skin than the rest of them, the other two in the crew of wise men or philosophers. And some think they were astrologers, and mainly from the religion of Zoroaster. I really don't know who to believe on this. In the Eastern tradition, the emphasis is on the baptism of Jesus, which we also listen to. That is what they celebrated, and this tradition of celebrating the baptism of Jesus on Epiphany probably started in the Eastern Church around the year 200, where that was the first reference to it, to Epiphany celebrated in the Eastern Church. And I've often wondered about these wise men. They show up, they meet with the king, they go, they pay homage, they bring these wonderful gifts that we still sing about, and then they disappear. A flash in the pan, a big show, and then they're gone, and you don't ever hear about them again in the story of Matthew, which is the only one that has this story. And then you don't hear anything about Jesus being revealed as coming from God and as God's Son until the baptism, which was probably around 30 years later. In this Gospel of Matthew, which was crafted probably by a Jewish author for a Jewish audience around, I would say, the year 80 to 90, somewhere in that decade, when this was written down, about 2 generations after Jesus lived. And this was crafted specifically to establish the pedigree of Jesus as being the Messiah for the Jewish people. If you start reading the book of Matthew and go and do that whenever you have time, look at the first chapter. It starts off with the ancestry of Jesus, the genealogy, indicating Jesus was coming from the line of David, King David. He was the king. So he's also from that royal line. And then we read in the passage that we listened to from the book of Micah, Micah chapter 5, in the first verse we read about Bethlehem being the city of David, of King David, and that a ruler will come forth from the city of Bethlehem, this little hamlet of Bethlehem. And it carries on to through the Gospel of Matthew with this narrative, this account of the birth, to say Jesus is indeed the Messiah of God. I don't want to focus any longer on the 2 different traditions. I think I'm boring you to death. And with a warm sanctuary, a bit too warm, you will catch up on sleep that you've perhaps missed. God's frozen chosen, warmed up with the nice new furnaces. What I want to focus on is the word epiphany. What does it mean? Where does it come from? It is a Greek word, and it depends on whether you take the Greek verb epiphaneo or whether you take the noun based on that verb epiphanein, which is, as at its root in the ancient Greek at least, an appearance. And it sometimes had the appearance of dawn, the light appearing. Sometimes it was used in literature about war, in the classical Greek, about the enemy appearing, seeing the enemy. In biblical language, which was a different Greek than the classical Greek, you find mostly the meaning of something being made known to someone, most probably through an intervention from God or a revelation from God. And you see it here in the book of Matthew as well. With the wise men, the Magi, you see the star confirming through the cosmos and the stars that yes, this is indeed the Messiah. And revealing through a dream to them that they should go back to another place or through a different route, not following the same route, not reporting back to King Herod. Then we find in the baptism tradition of the revelation that Jesus was the Messiah, indeed the Son of God, being revealed as the one that God sent to liberate Israel, to bring salvation to Israel. We see that word being used again there, being a revelation, an appearance of the presence of God, showing that Jesus was indeed the Messiah. And what does that have to do with us today? These 2 different traditions, these interesting narratives written for a Jewish audience to affirm also through the flight to Egypt, bringing in the Exodus story there, that liberation will come from Egypt, building that in as well. What does that have to do with us sitting here in a nice sanctuary, looking ahead for the year, and singing about the gifts that these three men who brought to Jesus, and about the heavens opening and being described, all right, this is a revelation. Jesus is the Messiah, the one sent from God. I want to say, let us as God's people simply find the clarity and the profound knowledge and the certainty today that us gathered here today, and all that we do and all that we profess to be, and all that we keep ourselves busy with as a community, the Congregational Church of Topsfield, as part of the broader church in the world, let we have the epiphany, the revelation, the manifestation of the presence of God, and may it bring clarity to us whether we experience God as being out there and in a mystical way showing us the road and showing us this revelation, or whether we experience God as inside of us, being part of us and finding expression through us, whichever way we experience God in our lives. Let we have that revelation, that epiphany, on this Epiphany Sunday, that all that we are and that we're supposed to be is based in and based on that unconditional love that I spoke about at the communion table. The God of love, and that our being church and our being Christian should be a response to that unconditional love and that unconditional acceptance that we celebrated through communion and that we speak about so many times in this sanctuary. May we have clarity on that. And unlike what I experience about the Magi, which is not necessarily correct, that they showed up for the big occasion, did their thing, and then went back to carry on with watching the stars or whatever they were doing or pondering life as philosophers. Let us, on this Epiphany Sunday, make it a life of epiphany from here on. Let it be an enduring presence for us, a faithful commitment to be God's people in covenant, expressing God's love here as we see each other, as we meet each other, living in the truth of the love of God, living lives of integrity, where what we confess and profess and what we express through our lives are not in disagreement with one another, so that our epiphany may be an enduring one, maybe one that brings light for our path and joy for living and hope in lives that are sometimes made difficult through confusing and complex circumstances in the world, and lives that are sometimes on the verge of depression because of the threatening environment that we often experience. May we be God's people and somehow understand something of what that means. May we, as God's people, also be the epiphany, the revelation, the manifestation of God's love to one another and our world. Amen.